Hello, welcome to another episode of New Wine Tastings. I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins. And New Wine is about building relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. New Wine Tastings is a series that we do, or a series of interviews and discussions at YouTube that we post in a variety of contexts, where we're given a taste of new wine and what new wine's about. And we're dealing presently with a series within the series of New Wine Tastings on advocacy, the theme of advocacy. And our guest today is Professor Kristyn Kidney, who oversees TESOL at Multnomah University. And I have just finally figured out how to translate over from the initials what TESOL stands for: Teaching English to Speakers of Other Languages. Professor Kidney, did I get that right this time?
Yes, you did. Great job.
Thank you. I feel proud of myself for once. And we're joined by pastoral leaders Trudi Sang and Cody Whittington. Kristyn's in Portland right now. I'm in Vancouver, Washington on Zoom. Cody's in Montana. Trudy's in Tigard, Oregon. So we're all over the place, but the interview is going to be very focused in terms of what we can learn on the subject of advocacy, helping people find and amplify their voices. Before we get into it, though, I just have to say that there's, besides just the great, profound value system of Professor Kidney and how she thinks about cultural engagement and how she engages diverse cultures, and we have a mutual regard for Japan, is just look at The Office. That's not fake. That's really her office. Compare that with my office, which is something in need of home improvement. Stark difference. If you compare my office down the hall from hers, mine is about cultural demolition. Hers is about cultural fruition, I guess you would call it. So anyway, thank you for joining us. Now, as we deal with this theme of advocacy and helping people find and amplify their voices, Professor Kidney, as I think about advocacy, I'm thinking about, and TESOL, it's about speaking, but it's more than speaking. It's about speaking, calling, amplifying. That's what advocacy is about. I think TESOL relates to that in certain respects. Advocacy relates to pleading on behalf of someone. I think there's a way in which TESOL has those components built in, and no doubt you'll share where that's accurate, where that's inaccurate, but that's my outsider point of view. And I think TESOL, again, is about speaking, calling, pleading on behalf of someone, helping them find how to express themselves, not helping to give them a voice, they have a voice, but helping them speak their voice in another language. They already speak in a language, it's speaking in another language, and assisting them in that context, while also affirming and advocating for their native culture and language. So important. Well, would you agree with this assessment? And what do you make of the idea of TESOL involving this dimension of advocacy?
Yeah, great intro there and great lead in. TESOL International, which is the sort of international professional organization and network for TESOL professionals, actually identifies advocacy as one of their core strategic areas for teacher training. So we're looking at what kinds of things do you need to know to be in TESOL, and advocacy is one of those areas they identify as critical to cultivating professionalism in TESOL. But I think to the question about speaking, there's a lot of speaking that goes on in TESOL for sure. We're teaching people to speak English, but we talk about language and as having these 4 core skills. So it's reading, writing, speaking, and listening. And then there's, of course, the overarching skills that hit all 4 of those of pronunciation, grammar, and vocabulary. Those sort of get to the nuts and bolts of language. And a lot of people, have their issues with grammar and all that. But when we're talking about those core areas, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, For me, advocacy is not just about speaking. It directs to speaking, but it begins in listening.
Mm.
And it's interesting, as we talk about what is language and what kinds of things do we learn when we learn language. A lot of us have experience in our first language of learning to read and learning to write. Maybe by the time we're in college and doing presentations, we're learning to give speeches and we're learning interpersonal communication. But listening is something we don't teach so much. We don't identify it as one of the classes you take. It's sort of this thing you develop along the way. And I think one of the fun things about TESOL is that we get to unpack what is listening. It's one of our 4 key themes. So how do we break that down into skill and translate that into objectives and things that are learnable? For me, advocacy always begins with listening. It begins with listening and begins with learning just lots of things about the context and the systems around what you're advocating for, who you're advocating with. And then hopefully it moves into speaking, sort of that use your words that we say a lot to kids when they're throwing a fit, use your words, explain what you want, don't just melt down, tell us what you need. And I think there's a component to speaking in advocacy for sure. But I want to address too sort of the language side of advocacy, what the word itself is doing. Because unfortunately, I would say all teaching or relational leadership professions involve advocacy. And I choose the word unfortunately there kind of intentionally, because I think often we think of advocacy as having this really positive connotation, because it's, it's being helpful, it's service, it's good work, and it is all that. But there's an unfortunate side of advocacy. Advocacy only exists because needs are going unmet, and that's not a good thing. It's great to have a good advocate, but it really stinks to need one, right? There's a somberness that we need to attach to the word advocacy. It's only happening because somebody's need is going unmet or unsatisfied.
Yeah, it's powerful. And it reminds me of another interview we've done in the past where, if I'm not mistaken, I think, and please correct me, but that your own work in pursuing TESOL as a career was bound up with a painful, tragic story of having an exchange student come and stay with you and your family and your community. And what happened to that student, it was traumatizing, of course, to the individual and to you. I think that stayed with you. My daughter, with my son's situation, is he has experienced traumatic brain injury. She's learning a lot. She's studying to be a nurse, and she's having a baptism by fire in terms of care and advocacy, and she might pursue neuronursing now. So the traumatic events of life lead toward advocacy if we're responding well, but it's not like it's always wonderful. It stinks, to use your language. Do you mind just sharing briefly about that? If that's not appropriate, I understand, but if I recall correctly, that was pivotal and catalytic for you moving forward in this direction with TESOL.
Yeah, so I think that particular experience was very shaping in understanding the needs that culturally, linguistically, racially diverse individuals experience in their resettlement process here. It was actually not an international student, it was a refugee background individual who had fled his country due to political unrest and violence. And so he had found hope and a new bright future here, which is always the sort of story or narrative we stamp onto refugee background individuals who come here. But it's not the whole story. It's not always what happens. Unfortunately, this individual, as he, stayed with our family, integrated into the community, found work, was learning language, all of that was this beautiful part of his journey. All of that came to a crashing halt when he was the victim of a hate crime. and actually experienced traumatic brain injury and was never the same after that. And seeing the struggle he went through, seeing, you know, having that early exposure to these kinds of stories are not the narrative we tell ourselves about what we offer people when they come here.
Yeah.
It definitely lays a foundation for there's advocacy work to be done on behalf of helping individuals through resettlement, but also to advocate in a way that isn't just making their voice louder, but that also primes the communities and the people and systems around them to receive them well, right? To hear that voice well, to hear their story, to understand who they are in their personhood and what they bring to the table. Yeah. So while I think we were good advocates, you know, for who he is and meeting our friends, we hadn't looked at our landscape and said, where are we and how will he be received in our community? And I think, you know, we were asked to take more refugee background individuals into our home, and wisely my parents chose not to, simply because we weren't in a place to receive them well, right? To have all of that network and support around us. So I think advocacy isn't just amplifying the voice, it's also priming the audience, right?
Yeah.
Who's going to hear this story? Who's going to hear the needs? And I think too of needs, you know, we're thinking of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So a lot of times we're told in our early social studies classes, the difference between a want and a need. And we get down to the very bottom of that pyramid. It's food, water, shelter. Those are your needs, and everything else is a want. But when we look at personhood, who we are, our soul, our spirit, our identity as individuals, as co-contributors of this world, of who God created us to be, we actually have this picture of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting with those sort of physiological needs. But everything on the pyramid is a need, right? Belonging, that sense of love, of esteem, of self-actualization. Those are still needs. It's not that they're any less of a need. It's just maybe some more of the basic needs have to be satisfied in order to optimally engage in those higher order needs.
Yeah, excellent. Wonderful reflections. I mean, you helped me understand hierarchy of needs better than what I was accustomed to through the Rolling Stones. I was immediately thinking about Mick Jagger singing, you don't always get what you want, but you get what you need. And I think he meant something probably very different in that classic Rolling Stones song. But all that said, you know, we talk about listening to the individual, right? Listening to the community that we're seeking to advocate for. And you and one of our other interviewees, Gloria Young, talked about the importance of listening right at the outset. You're adding a component here with, in light of your experience, no doubt, what you learned through that, it's listening to the individual or the community that you're seeking to advocate for, and in a sense, the reception community, listening to discern how are they going to receive this individual or this community. Really important that there's listening going on in both ways, so that at times you have to translate. At times we need to create need for more time and more space. And that is so difficult. I mean, this cohort that we're building these interviews for, it's a Doctor of Ministry cohort that deals with ambassadorship. And, you know, ambassador is bound up with a mediation. And there's a mediation aspect, and there's mediation bound up with advocacy. But, you know, look at Jesus. There's one mediator between God and humanity, this human Jesus, Paul says. And he had to listen to God. He had to listen to us in navigating and advocating, as he is the great advocate with the Spirit. So a lot there that you're sharing, and thank you, Kristyn. And Cody and Trudi, any thoughts that you have in response to what Professor Kidney's shared that you'd want to, in your pastoral context, to draw out or ask for further clarity and expansion?
When you talked about refugee receiving, and that, I mean, that was my in-laws. That's my husband. And fleeing under gunfire from the DR more recent, you know, when he was a child, but also from them, from communist China before. And, you know, I've learned a lot by listening to my in-laws and my family and just the context of what they're going. But it really hit me too when you talked about looking at the landscape of the receiving. You know, and I reflect back, how well were they received? And I know there was so much fear, you know, and now there's more of that resurfacing. So that idea of landscape and understanding that is a whole nother element that I really appreciate you bringing forward.
Yeah, and Trudi has an incredible story. Her husband has an incredible story about their migration under great duress. Needs to be put in a book form. It's amazing. So thank you, Trudi. Cody?
On those same lines, when you said advocacy isn't just amplifying the voice, it's priming the audience. That's probably one of the best ways I've ever heard that articulated. As far as, you know, you can't fire hose the receptive audience, or you run the risk of even hardening what you're trying to soften to be a receptive environment. And I don't know if you've experienced that more than what you shared, but it requires a lot of patience and more listening and more mediating. It's like it's the step between actualizing advocacy. And so I really appreciate that.
You know, just on that point, and Kristyn, please feel free to respond to this before I go into the next question, and what Cody and Trudi have said. But just building on what Cody said just now, it reminded me of a course I was teaching where, you know, I was very sympathetic, passionate about the concerns of Black Lives Matter, about brutality, even police brutality toward people with diverse ethnic backgrounds. And it was an online course, and I can't see a lot of the people's faces. They don't have their screen showing, and you're trying to navigate all that. And there was an African-American brother in the class who was very thoughtfully sharing his concerns. And I remember at one point saying, like, police officers, good police officers, and of course there are many good police officers, but he just felt like, he said to me, I don't know why you had to say that. And I was talking to someone else from another diverse ethnic background, and it's a tension point. And he said, you were setting the table so others could hear, because a lot of them, they don't hear anything once you hear critique. If you're in the dominant culture, they think, oh, you're anti-police, and I was just trying, and I'm not saying I did it right. I was trying to set the table. Not that someone needs me, but as the teacher, I was trying to get at this point. And, you know, I think a lot of times with advocacy work on race, and I have a real passion in that domain, not that it's my job to be the table setter, but I am trying to translate into communities that I wish we were further ahead in white evangelicalism on these things. We're not. We're really often the weaker brother, you know, to use Paul's language. But I still have to translate. I still have to work at that. Because I think what we're having, I just heard it recently from a politician. It doesn't matter if it's conservative Republican or liberal Democrat or what have you. Every side has blinders on matters. But, you know, just there's this criticism of being woke, and criticism like, you know, we're too woke, and they're making fun of woke and such. And I just go, I don't think we're awakened enough, regardless of the word woke. I think we have a long way to go and to be stretched. But I think there's this, you can call it racial fatigue, which I think is weakness, but it's like, I still have to deal with that. And I have to know the landscape. And Cody does a lot of that in his own work as a pastor, of whether it's for the left or the right, trying to, in a sense, set the table at the table, the church, the table. You know, Trudi does this in her work with the disability community, is setting the table so the dominant church culture can hear and receive. I think what they're doing in their own pastoral context is what you're doing in TESOL with helping to understand the terrain, as Lewis and Clark, so to speak, I guess. Any thoughts related to what Trudi and Cody and I are saying there before I go to the next question on landscape?
Yeah, I think it's so good to see how, just the language ties into all of this. I think when coming at this from the lens of TESOL, we see how just speaking into these matters is how we begin to affect change, but also how we invite others to speak into them too.
Yeah, I won't forget that anytime soon about landscape, and watch out for the landmines. So, earlier on when I was introducing you, I talked about what might be called voice for the voiceless. You hear that. And I've always been, I'll just be honest, I've been repulsed by that language because everyone has a voice. Even my son in his situation, for forever, for months, we didn't hear any noises other than coughing. And then we heard something like, a couple of weeks ago. And then now he said no twice. I love how the therapists are engaging. They're trying to find ways to help him communicate while they hope for him to regain language skills. But the speech therapist is working with hand gestures, just like sign language is a form of communication, not just hear, but like yes and no, the way he opens or closes his hand. He's responding to prompts. It's a miracle. I mean, call it medical miracle. He's responding. But even my son has a voice. It might not be always right here, the vocal cords, but he has a voice. And I love when nurses say, I've heard a nurse or two and a doctor say, we're waiting to see how he responds. They're not negating his agency. I think when we negate it for our congregants, for anyone we're working with our children, we need to help encourage them. Like, okay, find the words, don't have a meltdown. Someone needs to say that to me earlier today. My wife, she could have, said to me easily enough, find some words, Paul, find some words. So this idea of people already having a voice, amplifying that voice, could you speak to that in your work at TESOL and advocacy?
Yeah, I'm also not a fan of the phrase voice for the voiceless.
Why do we do that? Why do we?
One of the things that makes us who we are is that we have voice. We have ways of responding no matter who we are. I think advocacy means to call a voice. It's Latin advocare, to call, and it's related to vox or voice. So it's to call a voice. The phrase voice for the voiceless is just too much like supplanting someone else's voice or speaking over them. Instead, I think a better picture of what an advocate does is they call forth voices to the table. They hold the mic up. We're not grabbing the mic. We're holding the mic up to someone else. We're not taking the spotlight. We're positioning a spotlight on solutions. And the question is just, how do we do that well? What keeps me from going into fixer mode or drawing assumptions and trying to save the day as an advocate? That's not really the best way forward. That doesn't recognize the agency and the personhood of those I'm advocating for. So I think it's the role of learning. I'm sure you've learned a lot as you've been advocating for your son. You learn about his condition, or you learn about the systems of care and rehabilitation. You learn about the people in your care teams. There's a lot there that you learn about first. And then, because advocacy just comes with homework, it just does. The more you know about what's going on around the individual, the more you understand what the needs are and why they're not being satisfied. What is it that's the barrier there? And then there's also just that role of listening, of not, being the voice for the voiceless is wrong because it takes out the step of listening completely. So you listen for, even, in your son's case, those responses. That's listening for working with language minority students, sometimes that's calling in a translator to be able to understand them better, but also it's being patient enough to have big conversations with limited language.
Yeah.
I
It's
think
so good.
so often we talk about language, the language barrier, but language is never a barrier. Any shared language can be a bridge to understanding, and you can have big conversations with little words. I'm a big fan of throwing out ESL textbooks that say, this is a pencil and I want a hamburger. And that's not adult language, right? I have the joke is that every Japanese textbook starts with the phrase, this is a pencil. And
I've used them.
That's never a sentence I've needed to use. If I have a pencil, I've never had to explain its identity to anyone, right? They know, hey, that's a pencil. So using even limited language, you can have big conversations. I'll take current event photos and hang them around the room like an art gallery and have students walk the room and talk using sentence frames and using basic structures, have big conversations about current events in a level 1 class. I have this one beautiful picture of a class of girls who are studying literacy somewhere in the Middle East. And the question was, we were working on like present progressive tense. Okay, so super grammar nerd coming out full-fledged right here. But the concept was, tell me, what are they learning? What are they hoping? A level 1 student writes the sentence, they are hoping for new life. How much richer is that than this is a pencil, I want a hamburger, right? You can use those sentence frames and those structures to have big conversations to understand someone's perspective on education, on educating girls, on what that means in the context that they were in. We're having big conversations with limited language. So the concept that they have no voice, even with limited shared language, they have voice. They're learning to translate it. So I think setting up language hospitality activities where you're recognizing that there are deep thoughts within that can be expressed with a little bit of language.
I just realized that how I've been teaching theology wrong for years. What I start out the class with is, this is a Jesus pencil with a picture of Jesus on it. And this is a Jesus pencil, and this is a Jesus eraser, and this is a Jesus ... Everything's this is a Jesus. And, we just get locked in as theologians to this is a Jesus blank. And who lives that way? And, I find out by listening a lot about other people. When I fail to listen, I don't find anything out about them. And one of our other discussions in this series is on conflict resolution. And my default when I'm under stress is I'm a hammer, everything's a nail. That's my default. And that's not a good thing. In some cases, it's good. In extreme situation, burning building, you just have to get it done. But when I have a family member who's asking for me just to listen to it, for them to share their struggle, and I'm already in I'm going to deliver you mode. I've been told numerous times, I didn't ask for you to solve this problem. I asked you to listen. It's so hard for me, especially with a loved one. I just want to go and deal with it. And I struggle to listen at key times when I'm under stress. When I'm prepared, like in my son's situation, then I'm drawing out. But another thing with language is the kinds of questions we ask, whether it's English learners or other kinds of learning. I had to learn quickly with my own kids not to ask them yes/no questions so much. Like, did you do this? And they get really frustrated the older they get. And I think that the questions we ask in language acquisition or problem solving with advocacy are also important, in addition to, let's not use that this is a Jesus pencil statement. Any thoughts on that, Kristyn?
Yeah, learning to ask really good questions is a huge part of listening, right? So like the classic mom example is picking your kid up from school and saying, how was your day? And they say, fine, right? You get nothing else. But if you stop and ask, what made you laugh today? What frustrated you today? How, instead of just how was your day, actually asking the pieces. So when we're working with students who are struggling with maybe a sense of belonging or struggling with learning, because English is infinitely frustrating, right? I find myself—
where are the rules?
You can tell that we are a rebel culture by the
Mm-hmm.
way we break our own rules in our own language, right?
Yep.
So when we find those frustration points, I find myself constantly in class apologizing on behalf of the English language. When we're capable of pausing and saying, I'm sensing the frustration, speak to me about this. And then making making that time of listening move into actionable steps. So, okay, my students get frustrated because they go out in the world and they use English, albeit with some issues, and they're not understood, or they're looked down on, or they're disrespected. And they say to me over and over again, I hear, teacher, you understand me, but no other English speakers do. And they cultivate this idea that I'm the only one they can really talk to, or the only one that understands them. So what do I need to do in a situation like that? I've listened. Now I need to do something with it, right? So, one of the things I love doing with beginner classes is bringing in other people in the community or bringing in people from their school and having small groups that were discussion groups and giving them tasks to do. So they do discussion cards, or they just have some questions, and the maybe native English speaker, or maybe it's just a more proficient second language English speaker, is speaking with them. And they're just getting to know each other and learning to negotiate for meaning when they get stuck. Because I'd rather them learn how to negotiate for meaning, how to get past when they get stuck, than to go on believing that only a language teacher could ever understand the kind of English that they're speaking. So
that's really good. And Cody and Trudi, I wanted to ask you, in your own work, like Cody, as you bring people together of all different walks of life at the table, your church, to try and mediate and understand and build community in the midst of disparities and differences. And Trudi, with the disability community, where you're both advocating, one for community through difference for Cody, and then disability, alternative ability, other ability communities, to build equity and belonging, more than inclusion, belonging. How have you processed in a way where you help people, not like, well, how was the service today? Or how was, the service that was provided? Like, what frustrated you? What caused you joy? And I think, Kristyn, you were just asking about, or coming at it from another angle, helping people navigate and negotiate to problem solve together. How are you both? I know you are. That's why I'm asking. I'm asking because I know you are. But what are ways in which you're helping people to ask the better question, or you're asking the better question, and you're helping them negotiate, to work through it, instead of them always having to come through you to do it as leaders, as you seek to create a community of advocacy for one another? How are you doing that?
As you were sharing, I couldn't help but think of this very profound picture in my head. And it was the last picture that was taken of my mother-in-law before she passed. And it's her and my son sitting on the couch, acting like little pups with each other and watching Wheel of Fortune. And my son, his diagnosis he doesn't have tons of words. It's pretty condensed. And she didn't speak a lot of English, but somehow the two of them had this incredible bond and they're just interacting with such deep love for each other and appreciation. And it's just such a beautiful picture and a beautiful memory. And I think my son has has really taught me how to bridge communication without a lot of words, because he doesn't, but yet he knows everybody and crosses all different cultural spectrums of people, and without the judgment of categorizing. And but I think it's that whole thing, Kristyn, of just being an observer and seeing how, such like you said, the rich communication happened, and it was so precious. And I think we dismiss some of those beautiful divine moments, I feel.
Trudi, thanks for sharing that really helpful picture of what we've been talking about. I think around the life of the church, the table, we learned early on that you can't ask close-ended questions, because dialogues don't go anywhere. And so one question that we typically, at the end of each teaching, before we have a dialogue, we have 3 questions. The first question remains the same every single week. And it is, what resonated with or challenged you about this text, topic, or teaching, and why is that? And typically they don't have to get to the other questions. Like, that question alone has shown to lead the conversation into an organic, meaningful dialogue. And so the other 2 questions are ultimately just placeholders in case that first question backfires. But one of the reasons why we feel like we need to do that is, I was recently at a conference to kind of illustrate it, and they had a speaker talking about diversity and whatnot, and their landing point was, you need to focus on where you agree, not where you disagree. And I fundamentally disagree with that. Because I think one of the things that we've noticed at the table is that when you only focus on what you agree on, the level of the depth of the relationship is compromised. We need to be able to sit around the table and hold our disagreements with conviction, and but still maintain relationship. If it's not uncommon for people to say, I'm friends with so-and-so, so long as we don't talk about blank. Well, relationship is about being able to talk about blank and not abandoning the relationship. And so at the table, we say, yeah, honor and celebrate your similarities, but let's bring those differences to the table. And that's why we use that question, what resonated with or challenged you and why? Because that will highlight differences. And then you have to learn to dialogue about those things.
Further to that point that Cody was just getting at there, Kristyn, and also with what Trudi was saying with like limited vocabulary, there are ways in which the questions we ask limit. There are ways in which the way we engage those who are speakers of other languages in terms of their acquiring English can really stunt the acquisition. We're not amplifying their voice. We're not, providing them opportunities to grow and negotiate and navigate. Power dynamics come into play. We've already talked about the importance of amplify. I use that word. I would use that. I think amplify is a good word. We're trying to amplify their voices. We don't have to speak necessarily loudly, but so often in English, because of English as a language's power due to the culture and the influence of the United States and other English-speaking countries around the world, it has certain traction and it can be an imposition. Chinese is becoming a major player in the world. Before too long, it might replace. I know for the French, they weren't too happy when English overtook French, so to speak, because there is a prestige that goes with language, what language has power. There's an economic power, a political power. It's not just a word, it's not just a language. There's culture, and I think, that the word became flesh, the eternal word, but didn't come to this world in a power-grabbing way, but listened and learned and amplified people's voices, like the woman with the discharge, or the boy with the fish and bread. It's just amazing. So when we hear about what even Trudi and Cody are doing, whether it's limited words but speaking so well, or finding those questions that really draw people out to hold strong differences but in relation, how do we safeguard against power imbalances? Let's say a church is made up of a certain kind of political orientation or ideological orientation, but how do we make sure that those other voices are heard, and that it's not just like, well, we tolerate them, but we embrace and we amplify? I hope I'm making sense with how I'm weaving these questions together. Your thoughts on the power dynamics with English and how that relates to advocacy as a whole.
Yeah, so one of the things that we address a lot in our program, and you're speaking my heart language with this question, so it's like hard to know where to start, but it's just that English is a language of tremendous power. And I can throw down statistics like, there's 2 billion English language learners in the world right now, people learning English. English has become big business, humanitarian resource. It's often required for opportunities in education, employment, advocacy, access, just around the world. It's one of the official languages of 67 different countries. And if you start throwing in urban centers where English is widely used, that number explodes even larger. Over half of the World Wide Web is in English, and over half of all of the world's scientific and technical journals and periodicals are published in English. When you think about the fact that there are over 6,000 different languages in the world right now, and all of that consists of power statements about one language, you can begin to get a sense of just how powerful English is and why there are 2 billion people trying to learn it. It's this language of tremendous power, and it's a language of power in a world where languages are dying. So I said there's over 6,000 languages in the world today. It's estimated that by the end of this century, half of those languages will be extinct, gone forever. What happens when we lose a language? It's not that different from what happens with the extinction that we see in biodiversity. We lose a chain of things. We lose, a culture, a heritage, a lineage to past generations. We lose histories. We lose stories. The English teachers in our program are sort of learning about this tension and thinking, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't teach English. Maybe I can't do this. And I think it's not what you do, it's the way that you do it that counts. And so I think we have to think through this tension of power really carefully in order to teach a language of power while also representing a gospel that's rooted in humility. To do both well means to always posture yourself as a learner, to be a language learner. It speaks volumes to be an English speaker who is actively trying to learn a language of lesser power, and to celebrate language and cultural diversity, to make space for that in a classroom, to allow students to use their first language as a building block to learn their second language. I let students fill in their vocabulary notebooks with connectors. And usually what they write in that connector phase is, in that column, is something I can't understand. It's written in their language. It sounds like a word, or it looks like a word that they know, or it reminds them of a thing. And I have no idea what's in that column. I check that it's done because I think they need to connect their new to what they already have in ways that I might not understand. And that's okay. I'm comfortable with that ambiguity because I'm making space for their language and their tradition there. I think the church has to start thinking through, what is the role of a monolingual church in a multilingual society? How do we make language hospitality a reality in church and worship and in the way that we interact with one another? But I also think back to that, when a language dies, we lose its stories. In advocacy work, I think there's a huge role for story, for narrative. Because when you are doing advocacy, if you're calling forth a voice, that voice is calling for change. And change can be tricky. Change can be, it can be shame-based, it can be power-based, it can have all kinds of gnarly roots in it, right? So to facilitate change well, when you're using advocacy, when you're engaging in advocacy, I think there's a role for story. Stories help us navigate change. They help us with the change. They help us transition because we see a next. We see a movement. We see a chapter, a direction, or some way to resolve the tension. When things are brought to us in story, we find a way that we can play a positive role in what happens next. Instead of this sort of guilt dumping approach to advocacy on somebody who's maybe missed a need or missed an opportunity to respond well, we can narrate an opportunity to craft redemptive story. And I think that's what Jesus does so well. And that's such an understatement. Jesus does a lot of things well. Jesus does this so well. When we see Jesus invite his followers into development and into redemption, he so often did this with story, with parables. We see him address a need and then follow up by telling a story. And it's sort of that invitation approach to advocacy that says, come be a part of this story, not just for the sake of happy ending, but for that sense of developing our personhood, developing ourselves spiritually, is coming alongside what God is doing. And what God is doing is always redemptive, right?
And I really love that. And the whole thrust of story, which has a past, a present, and a future. I mean, the way I think of story, you know, when people are feeling threatened about change, well, we've gone through change before and it brought us to this point. So memory comes into play and the sense of hope comes into play. Well, yeah, change is scary, change is risky, but what if, what might be? So that sense of hope, the faith, hope, and love, you know, faith looks back, hope looks forward, love always is, as colleague Dr. Ron Frost says. And that's why it's the greatest, because there's that, and that's that connecting link. And I think love humbles us. Love humbles us to long for beauty and creativity that's beyond ourselves, and that we need other voices. And story doesn't do prescription mode all the time, like thou shalt do it better this next time. It's the possibilities that emerge is what I hear you saying. And we're so much better off with all those languages in the world. We're so much better off. I mean, it's not like we're all going to speak Hebrew. Nothing against Hebrew. It's not that we're all going to be speaking Swedish, my background in some ways, or German, or Brazil, you know, Portuguese or Japanese, but they will all be speaking the glory of God in their own tongues, you know, before the throne. And that hope should energize us. As we come to the close here, as we think through dominant positions, dominant cultural positions, the need for a posture of humility, the telling of story, language expression, that we would learn the languages of these other countries, that as we teach, we need to learn, right? And I know that's a passion that you have. What closing thoughts would you wish to share with our viewers and listeners, Kristyn?
I think I would just kind of sum up by saying that effective advocacy begins with learning. It moves to listening and seeing, you know, the personhood in anyone you're advocating with, not for, but with. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of prayer in advocacy, because change is something that God does, right? As we think about how we can meet small needs and do little things with great love, we do that even on the small level relationally and collaboratively. It is work that is done best when it's done together, and when it's done in collaboration with the way that God is already working.
Wonderful. And collaboration, conflict resolution. Bob Wall, former fire chief of Portland, part of this series, said that is the rare art form, and it's so hard to do. It takes time. It takes listening, like you're saying, learning, and that we see that we're stronger together than we are apart. It's not just everyone should speak English. English is fine. Chinese is fine, but there's a host of languages that are to be flourishing so that we can hear and speak the glory of God in diverse tongues, because the glory of God and the beauty of God is so multifaceted. So thank you for sharing with us from your own vantage point as an instructor, as a professor, working with language with TESOL. And I'm going to stop using that Jesus pencil throughout the term. This is a Jesus pencil. So Professor Kristyn Kidney, Pastor Trudi Sang, Pastor Cody Whittington, and myself, Paul Louis Metzger, an English language learner, wanted to sign off and thank you for joining us for this episode of New Wine Tastings, where it's about advocacy, helping people find and amplify their voice. Thank you all for joining us. Goodbye.